and certainly in light of those who didn't hear the news, unfortunately, there was a terror attack this morning in the Jordan Valley. A number of soldiers were attacked. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. I assume most people have seen the news, but unfortunately, it was a terror attack this morning. Yeah, the Jordan Valley. About 6 or 7 soldiers were injured. A couple of them very seriously. So, as we always open up, that we dive in that our learning should be a refuah for all those injured, certainly the most recent soldiers and everybody who has been injured. And it should be a tefillah and a zechut for our chatufim should return home safely. And Hashem should give nechama to all those who have been impacted by this war. And of course, during these very important meetings happening between world leaders as we speak, Hashem should give guidance to all of our leaders to make the right decisions for all of OUisrael and for the entire world. Be'ezrat Hashem. Okay, so I'm going to use a sports phrase for those who are familiar with the sport of football. I'm doing what's called an audible in terms of what I'm learning, which means that an audible in football. I'm teaching you guys some things. This is TORAH Mada right here, if you want to call it football Mada. In football, an audible is when a quarterback sees a certain play is planned, and then based on what he sees in front of him, he changes the play on the run. This week, I was planning on doing one thing. But based on the way that we ended last week and some feedback or some questions that came from the crowd, I want to do something a little bit different this week than I'd originally planned. Last week we kind of ended very quickly and rushed through some of the main sources for the value and the importance of having a set text. We discussed the background, and we discussed the background of the set text. We discussed the different opinions as to why Chazal or why the Anshe Knesset Hagedolah, different approaches to why Anshe Knesset Hagedolah had developed a set text. And then at the end, we discussed a number of potential reasons or positive results from having a set text. And because we didn't see the sources inside and we kind of rushed through that end, I decided that I wanted to begin this morning reviewing those because I think they're very important and they hopefully will add more meaning to our understanding of having a set text in Tefilah. And the second part of today actually is a result of some comments and questions that were asked, which is regarding the question of whether or not a person is allowed to daven and say the set text in a language other than Hebrew. If there are people who don't understand Hebrew, can they say daven shacharit? Can they daven Shmona Esrei in English? Can they daven in French? Can they daven in other languages? Which is a very, very fascinating halachic discussion. So that's what we're going to do for the second half of today. And next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll get to discussing personal tefillot and inserting personal tefillot into one's daily davening. So last week, just to do a quick review, aside from discussing the historical development of having a set text for Shmona Esrei, we discussed a number of different interpretations as to why specifically Anshe Knesset Hagedolah decided to create a set text. We saw that according to the Rambam, the reason why Anshe Knesset Hagedolah decided to create a set text was they came to the realization upon the return from the Galut, from the first Beit HaMikdash, as they rebuilt the second Beit HaMikdash, they came to the realization that that people's Hebrew language had eroded significantly, and that many other languages had become integrated and were now a part of the conversation and the culture. And therefore, they realized that people were not going to be able to practically be able to daven in their own language, meaning in Hebrew, on their own. And so Chazal or Anshe Knesset therefore realized that there was a need for a set text that would ensure that everybody would continue to daven in Hebrew for generations. That was according to the Rambam. We saw that according to Jonathan Sachs, his understanding of the development of the set text was a little bit different. According to Rav Sachs, it began in Galut. Once OUisrael were in Galut after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, there was a need to gather. There was a need to come together to converse and replace what had existed in the Beit HaMikdash. And that was the beginning, says Rav Sachs, of the concept of coming together to pray together. As many people say, right? The Jews that pray together stay together. We'll get to that when we talk about Tefilah B'tzibur. And Rav Sachs then suggested that it began in Galut, but as OUisrael continued and returned with the building of the Beit HaMikdash, there was a continued development of this set text of Shmona Esrei. And as Rav Sachs suggested, it really became mostly formulated with the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash once the Korbanot were no longer happening on a daily basis, then Tefilah took over the set structure of a korbanot used to be. There used to be korbanot that were very, very structured, and Tefilah was much more independent and unstructured. And with the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, as korbanot were no longer brought on a continual basis, Tefilah adopted the structure of korbanot, and therefore that also explains the Gemara that we know that talks about how Tefilah came to replace the korbanot. The third interpretation we saw for the development of the set text was Rav Shimon Schwab. And Rav Shimon Schwab noted something else that occurred during the second Beit HaMikdash, which is the end of Nevuah, the end of prophecy. And Rav Schwab suggested that during the times of the first and second Beit HaMikdash, even the regular layman, who was not necessarily a Navi in the way that we understood it, still was able to attain a certain level of prophecy because of all of the prophets that existed amongst OUisrael. And therefore, their ability to communicate and to develop and create meaningful tefillah was much more common. Once Nevuah, prophecy, ended towards the end of the second Beit HaMikdash with the death of Ezra, Nehemiah, or many people say that Ezra was Malachi, was the last Navi. As prophecy ended, people's ability to create and to write meaningful tefillot ended, and therefore there was much more of a need for a set text. Okay, and those are the three interpretations that we saw for why Anshe Knesset Hagedolah themselves created the set text of Shemona Esrei as we know it. What I'd like to do now, and again, it's really just a continuation of that, which is to now take a step back and look at today. Okay, today, much of what they described obviously still exists. There is no nevuah. The value of a set text still very much is in play. But I think if we think about it, there are a number of different advantages to having a set text that we mentioned briefly at the end of last year that I'd like to go over today. I think if we look at a number of sources, we can come up with, I would call, six different advantages to having a set text nowadays. Notwithstanding, obviously, certain challenges that arise, which I think Chazal account for as well. Okay, so the first main advantage to having a set text is what was highlighted by Rabbi Sachs and by the Rambam, which is that if we don't have a set text, the likelihood of of every single Jew continuing to daven and express themselves every single day on a consistent basis would be very low. Many people would daven when they had a tragedy. Many people would daven when things were going well, or when they felt like it. And many of us wouldn't daven if there was no obligation on a regular daily basis. We wake up in the morning, we're rushed, we have a lot of things going on, we have our family needs, we have our personal needs, and davening would probably likely get pushed to the side unless there was some major reason why we felt that need. In order to ensure, and this is what the Rambam was highlighting, that every single person would make sure to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu every single day, the set text contributes to that consistency. And so in order to ensure that we have that time, 3 times a day, or for those who daven less than 3 times a day, 2 times a day, in order to ensure that we do that, what was necessary was a set and very structured text, in addition to also having a set time. All of those things contribute to the ensured continuation of tefillah on a daily basis. So that's reason number one, which I don't even think we need a source for. I think that's just very logical, and it really builds off of what the Rambam and I think Rabbi Sachs highlighted. In addition, there are a number of sources that point to other advantages. Most specifically, and this is really a continuation, I think, of what Rav Schwab was saying. Rav Schwab was talking about how once there is a lack of nivu'ah, then our ability to construct meaningful tefillah text no longer existed. So there is the Rav Chaim Volozhin in his commentary on Pirkei Avot, source number one. I brought all the sources again for you. Source number one, the Ruach Chaim. He notes that the reason why a set text is important is because there is a unique mystical power to the text that was written by Anshe Knesset Hagedolah. And we'll see it inside in source number one. V'hine. Again, for those of you who came a little bit late, the reason why we're going over these sources again is because we didn't really see them inside and we kind of rushed through them. And I think they're fundamental to understanding the importance of a set text. So says Rav Chaim Volozhin, V'hine ataba avonotenu harabim. Says Rav Chaim Volozhin, now due to our many sins, avodatenu hirak hatfilah bimkom zevach umincha. Due to the sins of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, we no longer have korbanot. Now all we have is our tefillah. V'hadvarim omdim birumo shel olam. And these words, the words of our tefillah, they exist, and they exist on the highest levels, the highest realms of Shamayim. V'chol teva v'teva. And every single word, ole l'makom gavoa me'al gavoa. They go up to the highest, and they reach the highest places. Makom hakorban mamash. They reach just as high as where mystically the korban used to achieve. Says, now continues Rav Chaim Volozhin. V'chilo l'chinam kuf chet zikenim umehem kama neviim yastua. Right? It's not just for no reason that these 120 elders, including many prophets, were the ones who established this tefillah. V'halogam me'enosh ke'arkenu lo yipalei liyased bakashat kol tzarkenu. So then Rav Chaim Volozhin asks, wait a second, but why did they have to do it? Can't we? We're human beings. We are human beings. Many of us are very poetic. Many of us are very capable. Some are not. Some aren't. Some are less, and some are more. Okay? But many of us, why should we not be able to write and be able to contribute and to put together? Many people like us, lo yipalei, are not missing liyased bakashat kol tzarkenu, to be able to ask for what we need, or rifuot tachaluenu, or to be healed from our illnesses, bilashon limudim, in proper language. Vilama tzarich niviim. Why do you need prophets? Why can't each of us, especially those who are more capable, be able to construct a proper tefillah? Says Rav Chaim Volozhin the following: Achema kivnuba v'tiknua al ofen shetiyeh hakol kalul ba. Says Rav Chaim Volozhin, again, from a mystical perspective, the tefillah that was created and authored by Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, they had certain kavanot, they had certain intentions, v'tiknua, and they established it in a specific way that everything from a mystical perspective is included in the language of the Shmoneh Esrei. V'kol ish Yisrael kol echad mitpalel kefi havanato. They created a text that could be understood on different levels so that every single person could understand it on their level, and yet the power of it is much greater and deeper than we could possibly understand. And just to put this in perspective, this is very much in the worldview of Rav Chaim Volozhin. Rav Chaim Volozhin's famous work, he's made many works, but his famous work was something called the Nefesh HaChaim. And the Nefesh HaChaim was a book where he writes about the mystical power. It's a lot of different pieces, but the famous one, Shar Dalet, is about the mystical power of limud Torah, of learning Torah. And how learning Torah isn't just another way to attain knowledge, but that each time a person learns Torah, the mystical application, the mystical impact that has on the world is greater than we can even understand. And it's learned in the yeshivot as a fundamental sefer to understanding the importance of learning Torah. Along those same lines, he also understands the value of tefillah. Tefillah isn't just something that we do for ourselves. It isn't just something that has impact on us. It says, Rav Chaim Volozhin, it has a mystical impact on the entire world. The words that we're saying have much deeper meaning than we can even realize. And therefore, this text is not just a text that the rabbis happened to write. They included within it deep mystical interpretations and understandings that we might not fully understand, and therefore much more powerful than we know. We're now in the fourth line, the last three words of the line. Uklalo shel davar. And as a general rule, shemiyom shenitkina lo haya be'olam beit tefilot sheyasu roshem shaveh lemala v'sheyalu lemadrega achad. From the time that these tefilot were instituted, there were no two tefilot, two prayers that people made that had the same impact. The impact is always different depending on the person, depending on where they are at in life, depending on so many different aspects. And we will never fully understand the impact of our tefillot and the way that we daven. Ki mishuneh bazeh tefillat hayom mitfilat etmol, ki ya'avor v'hakol taloi b'tevot elu. The tefillah that we say one day is going to be different than the tefillah that we say another day, because things change, and everything depends on these words, on the power of these words. V'lakach hutzrach nivu'ah lazeh. That's why prophecy was needed. That's why these words needed to be written in prophecy. V'kol hakavanot v'hasodot shenitgalu al hatfilah ed hayom ena kitipa mayim hagadol neged hakavana shehisig mikuf chet hazekenim. And all the explanations and all the revelations that people write concerning this tefillah text, he says it's just a drop in the ocean. We will never fully understand the deep depths of the text of tefillah and the power of tefillah when we daven on a daily basis, because it was imbued with that holiness through the nivuah. I just want to finish this and then I'll take a question. Aval be'emet Hi givoa yoter mibinat kol adam. It is greater than the understanding that any human can properly ever understand. Vihi kosheret, this is beautiful language. Hi kosheret olam hatachton be'elyon. It connects the lower worlds and the upper worlds, kimo korban, just like a korban. And that was the explanation he gave of a korban. He said that a korban was, whereas Torah learning was taking the upper worlds and bringing it down into this world, a korban, and by extension Tefilah, is taking something from this world and bringing it up to the upper worlds. V'lo tishtanechat v'shalom ad biat hagoel b'mhera b'yameinu amen. And nothing will change. This is the text that will be with us until Be'ezrat Hashem, the coming of Mashiach. L'zeh amru, and that's why they said, and now he's getting back to, because this comment is actually on the comment, the first Mishnah, the second Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, HaTorah, al shlosha dvarim ha'olam ha'omed al Torah ve'al avodah ve'al gemilut chasadim. So he's explaining avodah. And then she says, Ulazeh amru al gimel dvarim ha'olam omed. This is what it means, he says, when they say that the world stands on three things. Ratza lomar, kishur olam elyon ba'olam ha'tachton. That the world, the combination, the connection between the upper worlds and the lower worlds, they consist of being built upon three different things. Al HaTorah, Torah shemorid al yedei shefa milamala, because Torah takes from the upper world and brings it down into this world. V'ala avodah, and what does avodah do? Shema'aleh nachat ruch metachton le'elyon, that it brings a connection from the lower worlds up into the upper worlds. V'achshav al yedei Tefilah, and that is what Tefilah does. Okay, so in very beautiful and poetic language, and I thought it was important to see his language because his language is very unique and very powerful and very evocative, where he's explaining how there is tremendous power to these words. Why do we need a set text? Very simply because this text has a certain mystical holiness that we don't fully understand, and therefore it is important for us to use this text because of its unique powers.
The tefillah of every different person is different according to his understanding of
Correct.
the text. But now you're saying that the words of the text have a mystical meaning above and beyond what anybody can understand, and therefore, and that meaning might be the same for everybody.
So I think he's saying the following. I think he's saying that there is unique power to these words, independent of what a person understands. At the same time, when a person uses these words and davens with these words based on his understanding and where he is in life, where it will get to and what the effect it will have will depend. But there's no question that that's because it's a combination of the power of the words and the person who is, I guess, giving and saying those words. But therefore, you need it's a combination of both. That's how I understand it. Yes.
Well, it seems to me that there's a great power in having called OUisrael a huge amount of people saying the same thing.
Excellent. Good. Correct. What you're highlighting is another reason, which we're going to get to as well, which is that part of the power of this is the unity. That's not what he's highlighting here, although I think it is a part of it. But yes, I think that's a very good point. We'll get to that. Yes.
Also, he's not saying that this Anshe Knesset Hagdolah set Tefilah is instead of self-expression. This
Correct.
would be a springboard for
Correct.
everybody to be able to access. And if you have extra things to say, by
Excellent. You are correct. You are.
don't have to. It's not substitute.
Absolute. We're going to correct. That's what we're going to talk about next week, which is that everything we're talking about now, the set text that we have, is only one side of the coin. And there's a whole second side of the coin, which is that Chazal also instituted within the set text opportunities for a person to have self-expression within the text, outside of the text, and we'll get to that next week. But 100%. That's why it's important when people say, "Oh, it's so hard." The answer: this is just the beginning. This is the base. We want to make sure that you daven. We want to make sure that you start with something. Those who are able to, and find the opportunity and are encouraged to add on their own, that Bezrat Hashem we'll get to in the future. Now, another, I think, less mystical way of saying this, and this is something that we mentioned last week as well, is that what a set text does is it doesn't just give us and help us daven, it also reminds us and highlights for us the important themes that we should be thinking about. Okay, we mentioned this last week, and I think it's an important point, right? Very few of us, if we were saying davening on our own, even if we were to say, okay, I would be the person who really would daven every single day, and it wouldn't depend on my emotion, it wouldn't depend on my mood, I would daven every single day. How many of us would be saying the words, Hashiva Shoftenu Kiva Rishona? How many of us would be saying, even personally, Slach lanu avinu, to ask for forgiveness? We'd probably be focusing on, God, give me this. God, give me that. Please take care of this. I need to take care of that. I'm having trouble with this, right? Most of the things that we have in Shemona Esrei, they include all of those opportunities, but they also include so many themes and so many things that we should be thinking about, right? Tekah b'shofar gadol l'cheirusinu, v'Yerushalayim ircha barachamim tashuv, both on a personal level and on a communal level. These are important and fundamental themes to us and to Jews, and we would all admit after looking at it, oh yeah, that's an important thing to think about. Okay, maybe we'd find one or two that we weren't 100% sure we understood, and we'd have to spend time understanding that, and maybe we'll do that if we're able to go through the Shemona Esrei one at a time. But I think we would, the concept of shalom, how many of us would get up and, okay, maybe during war we daven for shalom, sim shalom to al-vracha, but, or even modim on a fundamental, there's so many aspects to Shemona Esrei that many of us just wouldn't think about. And so by creating a set text, they're not just enabling us to daven every single day, they're also, as we mentioned last week, they're highlighting for us, these are the things you should be thinking about. These are the things you should be focusing on a daily basis. We should be saying to ourselves, and go El Yisrael, bring us the Geula. We should be thinking about Yerushalayim ircha barachim tashuv. I think many of us here in Eretz Yisrael think about that a little bit more maybe than we do in Gullus. But living in Yerushalayim, maybe we're also less sensitive to it because we see Yerushalayim bustling and we see how great Yerushalayim is. Maybe we don't have time to think as much about what we're still yearning for. Okay, there's so many different things here. And so what the Shemona Esrei really does is it's just a message and a lesson in what should be our priorities. What should be the thing we're both on a personal level. God, give me the wisdom to make the right decisions, right? Like we talked about before, God should give wisdom to our leaders to make the right decisions. God should give each of us the wisdom to make the right, not God, give me this and this, or God, have me do this and this. It should be, I'm okay, I'm going to make that decision, but please give me the wisdom to make the right decision. Or give me the wisdom to know how to make the right decision. And please, God, forgive me for my sins. And please, God, and of course, and the other things that are important. And of course, as the Shemona Esrei continues, it moves to more national and communal things where Chazal are basically saying, these are things that you should be thinking about. And that, I think, is another reason for the set text, because it's a message to us of, these should be your priorities. These should be the things that you are thinking about. Taking this a step further, if you look at source number 2, Rabbi Chaim Halevi Donin, who is an American Orthodox rabbi, wrote a book called "To Pray as a Jew." Are there any more sheets? I think the sheets were all in the front. There were no more, so I apologize. I guess we'll have to ask them to make more copies moving forward. That's a good sign, I guess, on some level. But okay, if there are some extras here, so please pass them down. That would be great. Thank you. Here. Here's a couple. Here. Here's another one. If you could just pass these down. Pass down here. Okay. I try to save as many trees as we can, so they're a little bit smaller the text. But if we need to, we'll try to make it bigger. Okay, so I'm very into, as you can see, providing the sources, and I try to find the balance between giving you the sources, but not giving you too many sources and killing too many trees, because we have to find that balance. But Rabbi Chaim Donin, a very, very well-known, I would say an American classic, To Pray as a Jew, has a beautiful line where he talks about how when we daven, and this is similar to what we were talking about before, when we daven, we're connecting to all other Jews, and we're also connecting to many of the important values and many of the values and ideals of Judaism. Look at source number 2. Prayer does not belong exclusively to the followers of one faith. All people who believe in God are moved at one time or another to utter a heartfelt prayer to Him. And sometimes confirmed non-believers are equally moved. But if prayer is common to all faiths, what makes Jewish prayer Jewish? Jewish prayer is prayer that uses the idiom of the Hebrew Bible and reflects the Jewish soul. It is prayer that expresses the basic values of the Jewish people and affirms the central articles of Jewish faith. It is prayer that reflects our historical experience and gives expression to our future aspirations. When the prayer of a Jewish person does not reflect one of these components, please excuse the typo, he may be praying, but it cannot be said that he is praying as a Jew. A Jew may choose his own words when praying to God, as we're going to talk about in the future, but when he uses the words of the sitter, he becomes part of a people. He identifies with Jews everywhere who use the same words and express the same thoughts. He affirms the principle of mutual responsibility and concern. He takes his place at the dawn of history as he binds himself to Avram, Isaac, and Yaakov. He asserts his rights to a Jewish future in this world and to personal redemption in the world to come. Whatever is special about Jewish theology, whatever is special about Jewish values, whatever is special about Jewish history is also special about Jewish prayer. And so he highlights what you were saying, but in a much more beautiful way than I could ever say it, which is, number one, we're connecting to all of the values of Judaism, similar to what we were talking about before, but we're also connecting to all other Jews. As we mentioned before, even though obviously there are different streams, there's Ashkenaz and Sephardi and Sfard and Edut Mizrach and Teimani and Yerushalmi and Hasidish. And there are points where sometimes I'll walk and be like, wait a second, is this the same religion? But no, that's a joke, because fundamentally it is. Fundamentally, I can walk into anywhere in the world where there is a minyan and feel comfortable davening Shacharis, Mincha, and Mariv. And there's something both inspiring and important about that. The fact that everybody is saying the fundamentally same text with different variations, which, by the way, only enrich our Judaism because they take with them the cultures and everything that of Jewish history, is incredibly important and incredibly valuable. When we daven the text that we're davening the same thing that they have been davening for thousands and thousands of years, that the same thing that millions of Jews are davening all over the world, and the same thing that Be'ezrat Hashem, our descendants, will continue to be davening until Ad Bias Goal Tzedek, and maybe even after that, for all we know. Be'ezrat Hashem. Yes?
Conservative Judaism was the main framework, or even Reform Judaism. Now, how do you get them? This is ideal.
So I don't want. No, I don't think it's our place to talk about other sects of Judaism or other streams of Judaism. And I just also don't think that. I mean, again, okay. If it didn't work, then all that does. If we believe that it didn't work, and I personally believe that it didn't work, it only highlights what we're saying, and I think that's the point. Yes. Agreed. I think the point that you're making, the most important point that you're making, is what you just said a minute ago, which is, again, as you look at the development of the streams of Judaism, and again, this isn't to say anything bad, chas v'shalom, history proves itself, and we've seen that certain decisions that other streams made regarding various things turned out to be the wrong decision for the sake of those streams. I'll just give you an example, and this is what you said. And I think it's an important. My father always used to say. You said that when he was, as many of you know, my father was the rabbi in Englewood, New Jersey, for many years. Hopefully, you'll all stick around for his shiur 11:15, much better than mine. And he said that one time he had a conservative rabbi with whom he was friendly, in the area of New Jersey, who told him that he was jealous of him. He said that because of the decision that the conservative movement made to allow Jews to drive to shul, the inadvertent consequence, which maybe they didn't fully understand, unintended consequence is the proper word, was that there was no longer a sense of community. The fact that Orthodox Jews need to live within walking distance to their shul created a sense of community around the shul, which was much more conducive to the development of the community. The shul, a non-Orthodox shul, that enables their members to drive to shul. Its members can live an hour away and drive to shul, and they no longer have that sense of community. And therefore, it created, and without what they thought they were doing was bringing more people in, and this was an unintended consequence. Now, does that mean that every decision they made? Again, I don't want to get into the theology of all of that, but I think you are correct. I think you are pointing out something very different, which is very important, which is what we have to highlight here is the fact that we've kept our tradition over those years, and that we have kept the set text over those years, is a symbol of the power of the Orthodox community, and itself is the symbol of the strength of who we are. That we can move in wherever we are and move to whatever city we want, in any country we want, to be able to feel comfortable with those practices, and specifically with the Tefilah, shows the power of a set text. Okay. To take this even a step further, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in his introduction to the Quran Siddur, notes how the beauty of our set text is not just that it connects all of us, but that our tefillot, the text that has been written, weaves together in a beautiful way all of Jewish history. And it echoes so much of what has happened over the course of Jewish history. And again, in language that only Rabbi Sachs could write in. The Siddur is the choral symphony the covenantal people have sung to God across 40 centuries, from the days of the patriarchs until the present day. In it, we hear the voices of Israel's prophets, priests, and kings, its sages and scholars, poets and philosophers, rationalists and mystics, singing in calibrated harmony. Its libretto weaves together texts from almost every part of the vast library of Jewish spirituality. Torah, the prophets, the writings, the classic compendia of the oral law, Mishnah, Midrash, and Talmud, together with philosophical passages like Maimonides' 13 Principles of Faith and extracts from the Zohar, the key text of Jewish mysticism. There is space in Judaism for private meditation, the personal plea. But when we pray publicly, we do so as members of a people who have served, spoken to, and wrestled with God for longer and in more varied circumstances than any other in history. We use the words of the greatest of those who came before us to make our prayers articulate and to join them to the prayers of others throughout the world and throughout the centuries. Almost every age and major Jewish community has added something of its own: new words, prayers, customs, and melodies. There are many different liturgies: Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Oriental, Yemenite, Italian, those of Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Arizal, and the Vilna Gaon, and others, each with its own subdivisions. Each tradition has a character of its own, to which the Jewish law applies the principle Nahara ufashte. Every river has its own course. Each of the historic traditions has its own integrity, its own channel through which words stream from earth to heaven. And so, as Rabbi Sachs beautifully points out, our text, our siddur as it is really, as he calls it, this choral symphony of all of Jewish history, from the times of the way that Chazal incorporate the tefillot from the Torah itself, through the Navi, through Sefer Tehillim, through everything that has been added over the course of Jewish history. It's really just, so the set text is not just a way for us to daven. It's not just a way to that we all have a base for which we're all saying the same thing. It's so much deeper and so much greater. And that, I think, is important for us to realize. Despite the challenges of a set text, there is so much that is richer. We're so much richer because of the text that we have. One final approach to the value of having a set text is mentioned by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, also a really very, very special Talmid Chacham and Jewish scholar in America in the mid to late 1900s. He has a great book, I think I've quoted it before, called Jewish Meditation. And in Jewish Meditation, he writes about how much of Tefilah, or aspects of Tefilah, really are on some level meant to be a form of meditative discipline. And so he suggests that part of the reason why there is a set text, and he also notes that this is why we say it 3 times a day, is because fundamentally much of Tefilah was meant to be a form of meditation. Now, when we think of meditation, many of us think of like someone sitting cross-legged and going like this, and in some far east country. But meditation really is just controlled thinking. Is an ability to control our thoughts, to think about the things that we want to, and to be able to focus on various things. And so he suggests that one of the reasons we have a set text, aside from everything else we discussed, was to enable somebody to be able to use this as a meditative discipline. By the way, his interpretation is that's what it meant when the Chazal say that the Hasidim Rishonim used to come an hour before Tefilah in order to prepare for davening. What were they saying? They're doing it for an hour, so they could say they were learning. You could say they went to the mikvah. You could say there's lots of different interpretations, and nowadays probably everyone would find a way to interpret it in the way that fits into what speaks to them. But his suggestion was what they were doing was they were sitting down and trying to get into the state to achieve a state of meditation that would enable the tefillah to be what it was originally intended to be. Look at source number 4. I brought you a small excerpt from what he says. Again, I recommend the book. It's really, really an excellent and very, in my opinion, very original type of book. He read many early Kabbalistic sources that talk about and also connects them to many different meditative sources as well. Source number 4. The Great Assembly also realized that the general populace would need a meditative discipline. But rather than have it be something loose and unstructured, they needed a discipline with a structure common to the entire Jewish nation, one that would serve as a means of uniting the people. It would have to contain the hopes and aspirations of the nation as a whole to reinforce the unity of the Jewish people. The meditative discipline that was composed by the Great Assembly, what we call the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, ended up as the Amidah, sorry for the typo, a standing prayer consisting of 18 sections, which would be repeated silently in an upright position 3 times a day. It is true that nowadays the Amidah is thought of more as a prayer than a meditative device, but the most ancient sources regard it as a meditation. Indeed, the Talmud verifies that this was its original intention. This also explains why the Great Assembly has legislated that the same prayer be repeated 3 times each day. People often complain that saying the same prayer over and over is tedious and uninspiring. For anyone familiar with mantra meditation, however, the opposite is true. All types of mantra meditation involve repetition. In mantra meditation, the device repeated is a word or a phrase, and it can be repeated over and over for weeks, months, or even years on end. The Amida was meant to be repeated 3 times every day from childhood on, and essentially the same formula would be said for an entire lifetime. The Amida could therefore be looked upon as one long mantra. In many ways, it has the same effects as a mantra, lifting the individual to a high meditative level of consciousness. As we shall see, there is an entire literature that describes how the Amida can be used in this manner. But most important, there is ample evidence that it was originally composed, sorry again for the typos, as the common form of meditation to be used by the entire nation. Okay, now for some people this might not speak to you. The idea of meditation, mantra meditation might not be what speaks most to you, but I think it's an important understanding of the text. I remember that when I read this book when I was personally in yeshiva, my Shana Aleph, I had a little bit more time than I do nowadays in my life, and I use certain aspects of this. I wouldn't say I'm a meditative type of person, but some of the tools he used, he talks about the idea of focusing on Shemona Esrei and taking time to focus on every single word. And again, I highly recommend the book amongst all the other sources, because I think there's a lot to this. The ability to control our minds, which I think is what we probably struggle with the most. And I do, and I imagine many of you as well. During Shemona Esrei, where you start Shemona Esrei, you think you're good, and then like 2 minutes later, you're like, how am I thinking about the New York Yankees when I was just talking about like Hashiva Shovtenu Kiva Rishona? But the way our minds go, it's challenging. And so what meditation is fundamentally is just helping us control our thoughts in a meaningful way. And therefore, this is just another approach to the value of having a set text. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Correct. Okay, so what he's raising is that meditation as controlled thinking requires a certain amount of time, and the pace of many of our shuls creates that challenge. Agreed. Although I would argue that the one place where it can be used, even in our shuls that in our shuls that are quick, is in Shemona Esrei. When a person is davening Shemona Esrei on their own, they're welcome. They're welcome to have it in a different way. That was where I used it the most. But you are correct. The one challenge I would say is we could also learn from the Hasidim Rishonim, which is they came an hour before davening. If we all come an hour before davening and we get into the mode and we have our talis and tefillin on, maybe we even start. Again, I'm not chas v'shalom criticizing you. I'm criticizing myself as well. I think some of this could be, I know that when I personally am davening in a shul that is particularly quick, I try, at least in my mind, I try to get there earlier so that I know that if I can start Psukei de Zimra. Again, the davening with the minyan is always going to be a balance between the needs of the community and the needs of the individual. And every individual needs to figure out how they can fit within that community. I think it's a good question. Good question. You can ask Rashai when he comes in a couple of shirim. He's the rabbi. He's the rabbi of the shul. I'm not the rabbi of a community, so I can't. It's an excellent question, and I think the role of the rabbi is, as I said, to balance the needs of the community as well as the needs of individuals and find that right balance. And I think it's incumbent upon us as well to also balance our needs and the community's needs. And I find that usually when it comes to Tefilah, there is a way with us being willing to challenge ourselves to find that right balance. Quick.
Meditation. It's there.
Great. Meditation. Yes, we'll see. We're going to see soon. Yeah.
But with all the people going to India and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
For him to say it,
I'll say even more than that. We're going to see next week that the idea of having time to yourself to daven outside of the tefillot, what Rabbi Nachman called hitbodedut, is fundamental. And that's true, but we're talking more about the value of meditation within the set text and the value of having those words repeated every day. There is a certain value to that. Yes. One more question, then we're going to go on. Or comment.
Kaplan, his era was more 60s, 70s, where hippie stuff.
Interesting.
And so I wonder if it really isn't the same as a current idea of mindfulness that's going on.
Yes. Absolutely. I don't think the term mindfulness was as common back then. I think, again, you have to read the book, but I haven't read it in a while. But a lot of what he was trying to show is that we think of meditation as just this, like I said, someone sitting cross-legged in the Far East. But he said what meditation really is what we would call. I mean, there's different types of meditation, but a big part of it is, like, when I say controlled thinking, that's what mindfulness. I mean, I'm not an expert in mindfulness, but mindfulness is, at the end of the day, is an ability to have more control over living in the moment, over controlling your thoughts, and not letting competing or impeding thoughts come in and take control, and living much more in the moment, being mindful of what you're thinking about and what's going on in your mind. And I think absolutely, I think meditation definitely is a part of that, or one aspect of meditation definitely is that. Yeah, yes.
I'm curious as to what the rabbis feel about inserting Rufaenu. I think everybody agrees that you can insert.
Yes, we're going to get to that next week. We're going to talk practically about that next week. Next week, we're going to discuss the specific halachic guidelines for inserting things throughout Shemona Esrei, where and when. Absolutely. It exists, and it's not just doesn't exist, it's an invitation for people. And I think that's, as I said, the other side of the coin to the set text. You have a set text, but you also have part of the way they established it was an ability for people, and encouraged, to add in personal tefillah, which we'll get to next week. Okay, well, as I said, that was just section number 1, which is really revisiting those sources that we did very quickly last week to get a deeper understanding of the importance of a set text. What I want to do now, as I mentioned, is I want to focus on a question that has come up. A number of you have asked me this question, and I think it's an important question, which is the question of being able to say the set text, to daven, in a language other than Hebrew. Meaning, we've seen that there's an importance to the text. We've seen that, obviously, I would even say that according to Chaim Volozhin, there is an importance to saying it in Hebrew. We see that there's a value to saying it in Hebrew. But what if somebody doesn't speak Hebrew? What if someone doesn't understand Hebrew? They feel more comfortable in a different language. And is one allowed to say the set text in a different language? And this is a big halachic discussion. And I wanted to just go through the major sources with you and see how we conclude halacha l'maisa, because I think it's an important part toward this whole conversation. The Gemara, the sources begin, the conversation begins with a Mishnah and a Gemara in source number 5. The Gemara in Mesechet Sota, source number 5, the Mishnah says the following thing: Elu ne'emarin b'chol lashon. The Mishnah is going to list a number of different texts that are allowed to be said in any language, and then it contrasts it with a number of texts that need to be said specifically in Hebrew. So says the Mishnah, the following texts may be said in any language. Parshat Sota, okay, the parsha that a Kohen has the Sota say, before the Sota is killed. Again, the process is much longer and more complex than we're going to discuss today. But there's a whole section, that she does, that is read to her as part of the process before she, as she is being accused of committing adultery, before she is killed. That parsha can be said in any language. Vidoy ma'aser, when a person comes and brings all of the ma'aser, all of the tithes that he needs to bring to the Kohen, at the end of a certain amount of years, you need to make sure that you get rid of all of the ma'aser that you may have kept in your home, that you failed to give to whoever needed to give to. There's a certain text that you say in Parshat Kitavo, they say a certain text. That text can be said in any language. Kriyat Shema Utfila. Both Kriyat Shema and Tefillah can be said in any language. As we've seen, the halacha distinguishes between these two, even though we put them all as part of our daily tefillah. They are two separate mitzvot. Kriyat Shema, involves the mitzvah of what's called Kabbalat O Malchut Shemaim, accepting upon yourself the yoke of heaven and saying the 3 parshiyot of Shema. And tefillah generally refers to Shemona Esrei. Birkat HaMazon, and when a person benches, the Birkat HaMazon can be said in any language. Ushvuat Haidut, Ushvuat Pikadon. Certain types of shvuot, certain types of swearing that a person needs to swear in Beit Din, under certain circumstances, that shvuah can be said in any language. And then says the Mishnah, Ve'elu ne'emarim b'lashon hakodesh, and the following things need to be said specifically only in Hebrew, just to see them to finish the Mishnah. Mikra bikurim, when the person would bring the bikurim, when the person would bring the first fruits to the Beit HaMikdash, there was a few psukim he needed to say, those needed to be said in Hebrew. Chalitza, as part of the chalitza process, when a person, if a woman's husband dies and she has no children, there is a mitzvah that she should marry the husband's brother. Nowadays we don't do this, but the other option always existed, and that's what we do nowadays. We do the process of chalitza, where it's a whole process by where the husband, the brother refuses to marry the wife, and he frees her from any connection. That there's a whole text that needs to be said, and that text needs to be said in Hebrew. Brachot uklalot. When we discuss the various brachot and klalot at Har Grizim and Har Eval, which were quoted in if I'm not mistaken, we're talking about in Nitzavim. So those brachot and klalot, or actually it's actually in Kitavo as well. Those brachot and klalot, the blessings and the curses, need to be said in Hebrew. And Birkat Kohanim, and the Birkat Kohanim, the bracha of the Kohanim, as we know that they say every single day as part of the Shemona Esrei, those all need to be said in Hebrew. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now what the Gemara proceeds to do is to discuss each of these and try to understand why certain ones are specifically allowed to be said in any language and other ones need to be said in Hebrew. So look at source number 6, where the Gemara discusses Tefilah. Why can Tefilah? Why we're going to focus specifically on Tefilah, not just on Shema, not really on Shema so much. Why can Tefilah be said in any language? Says the Gemara, Rachmininu. It's about creating a relationship. It's about asking for mercy from Hashem. Kol heichi deba'i matzli. Any way or in any fashion that a person wants to be able to ask for mercy and connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he's allowed to daven. Okay, so very clearly, very simply, why can Tefilah be said in any language? Because it's all about connection. It's all about relating to Hashem. And therefore, we encourage anyone to do that in any language. But the conversation doesn't stop there. Ask the Gemara, really? Utfilah b'chol lashon. Can Tefilah really be said in any language? But we have a source that seems to contradict that. Ve'ha'amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda says the following. Le'olam al yish'al adam tzrachav b'lashon aramit. That a person should never ask for his personal needs in Aramaic. Why? De'amar Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan says, Kol hasho'el tzrachav b'lashon arami, ein malachei hasharet niskakin lo. If anyone asks or davens for things in Aramaic, the malachim, the angels up in heaven, will not help him. Why? Lefi she'ein malachei hasharet makirin b'lashon arami, because they don't understand the Aramaic language. Now again, we're not really going to understand exactly what the angels, what they understand. Some say it doesn't mean they don't understand it. It means they don't like this language. It's ironic because all of Gemara is written in Aramaic. That's an area that we're not going to get into here. Okay? What the Gemara seems to clearly say is this source seems to indicate that a person should not daven in Aramaic, which means you shouldn't daven in a different language. So how does that fit in with our Mishnah? Answers the Gemara, lo kashya. It's not a question. Ha biyachid, ha bitzibur. One is talking about a case where a person is davening on their own, biyichidut, not in the context of a tzibur, of 10 men or of a minyan. And one is davening with a tzibur. The simple understanding is what the Gemara is basically saying is if you're davening with a tzibur, you're davening with 10 men as part of a minyan, so then your tefillah has much more power to it. And therefore, even davening in a different language would be okay. But if you're davening on your own, then you should not daven in another language because you don't have the power of the tzibur of the minyan, and therefore you should not daven in another language. You should daven only in Hebrew. Okay, that's the simple understanding of this Gemara. Now, before you all panic and think about, wait a second, I daven in a different language and I don't always daven. Okay, so there's a big machlokes rishonim. We're going to do some Gemara today. There is a big machlokes rishonim. There's a big three-way machlokes how to understand the conclusion of this Gemara. Okay, how do we understand the conclusion of this Gemara? If you look at source number 7, the Rif, okay, Rav Yehuda al-Fasi, one of the main Rishonim, early commentators on the Gemara, he understands the Gemara the way that I just explained it to you. He says, in source number 7, Ha dikatani, tfilah bechol lashon, when the Mishnah said that a person can daven tfilah in any language they want, Hani mili bitzibur aval biyachid lo. That meant if you're davening with a minyan. If you're davening with a minyan, you can say the Shemona Esrei in any language that you want. But if you're davening without a minyan, you must say it in Hebrew. That's the Rif's understanding of this Gemara, which would mean that there might be some challenge in what some people are doing nowadays, because that doesn't seem to be what we do nowadays. But that's one understanding. That's the Rif. Okay. The second explanation is Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah in source number 8. We're not going to see the whole thing inside. He quotes the Rif, and he says, but this doesn't make any sense. Because he says, for example, he says, I know in our communities, there are many women who, as we know, are not necessarily makbid to daven with the minyan. And they sometimes will daven in a different language because they're not comfortable in Hebrew. So how does that fit with what we know is the minhag in our communities? And therefore, he quotes a different explanation. This is actually a very unique explanation. He says, no, what the Gemara meant was the following. The Gemara was saying that if you're going to daven the text of the tzibur, if you're going to daven the set text of the tzibur, similar to what the tzibur davens, i.e., the main text of Shemona Esrei, that can be said in any language. When a person wants to daven their own personal tefillot, that must be said in Hebrew. Now, don't get discouraged because we don't paskin like this. But this is his interpretation of the Gemara. When the Gemara says Rabbeinu Yonah, ha biyachid, ha b'tzibur, they weren't referring to are you physically with the minyan or without. It was referring to are you saying the text of the tzibur, or are you saying the text, the personal prayer that a person adds on their own? Says Rabbeinu Yonah, If a person is davening with the text of the tzibor, even if you're doing it in your living room, but you're saying the text of the community, that's going to have a special power, and you can say it in any language you want. But if you're davening your own personal prayers, you're saying something to Hashem that you want for yourself, that's what he calls yachid. It could even be in the minyan, but you're saying your own text. That, he says, needs to be in Hebrew because it needs that extra power to get to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Good. Now so again, we don't paskin like this. Yes, we're going to get to that next week. That was the Rabbeinu Yonah. Now, we don't paskin like that. It's important to see the different explanations. Then we have the third explanation, and that is the explanation of the Rush. The Rush, again, Rabbeinu Asher, another one of the Rishonim, he quotes all these different opinions, source number 9, and he says, no, they're all misunderstanding the Gemara. He says, really, the only problem, the only language that you have to be careful about is Aramaic. He says Aramaic, there's something about Aramaic that if you're davening by yourself, you shouldn't daven in Aramaic, you should and you should daven only in Hebrew. But any other language, there's no difference between a yachid and a tzibor. When the Gemara asked the question and said, wait, our Mishnah says you can daven in any language, but then we have someone saying you shouldn't daven in Aramaic, that was specific to Aramaic. Says the Rush, really? A person, as the Mishnah implies, is allowed to daven, whether he's davening on his own, he or she is davening on his own, or they're davening with the minyan, they can daven in any language that they understand. When the Gemara said, but you can only daven like this with a tzibor, that meant specifically Aramaic. So again, think about it for a second. Where do we say Kaddish? Only with the minyan. That is why many tefillot that we may be familiar with, by the way, this also applies to Yikum Purkan. There are many tefillot that are part of our text, which we only say with a minyan, and many people aren't aware that you should only say them with a minyan. But that's more of a technical point, okay? According to this conclusion of the Gemara, in the end, and look at the Shulchan Aruch in source number 10, the Shulchan Aruch quotes all three opinions. He quotes all three opinions because that's what he very often does. Sometimes he'll quote three opinions. In this case, look at source number 10. I'll read it for you just to see it inside. It's important to see some of these sources inside. Yachol lehitpalel below chol lashon sheyirtzeh. You can daven in any language you want. Hani mili b'tzibor, but only as a community. Aval b'yachid lo, but if as an individual you shouldn't. Who is that according to? That's according to the Rif. That's the first opinion we quoted. Okay? Then he says, v'yesh omrim, the end of the first line. The hani mili kishe shoel tzrachav kigon shit palel al chole o al shum tzar sheyesh beveto aval Tefilah kvual tzibor afilu yachid yachol omran. Then he says, no, maybe the distinction isn't between with a minyan and without a minyan. It's which text you're saying. Are you saying the text of the tzibor or your personal text? And that's as we saw, that's the opinion of Rabbeinu Yonah. And then he says, v'yesh omrim, the third opinion, which is how we paskin, de'af yachid, even an individual, kishe shoel tzrachav, if he's davening for his own personal tefillah, or if he's saying the text, yachol lishol b'chol lashon sheyirtzeh, he can say it in any language, chutz mi lashon Arami, except for Aramaic. Aramaic, the angels have a problem with. I can't explain to you what their problem is. And again, the irony of the fact that all of Gemara is in Aramaic, again, it's a topic for another time. But that is, so as to conclude, halachically, according to the Shulchan Aruch, if a person does not understand Hebrew, can they daven in a language that they understand? The answer is yes. However, and we're not going to see it inside because of time, the Mishnah Berurah in source number 11 does bring a couple of, I would say, provisos to this blanket heter, this blanket allowance. And he says the following. He says, basically, in summary, there are two options. If a person does not understand Hebrew, they have two options. They can daven in Hebrew. The halacha does say that if you say the words in Hebrew, even if you don't understand them, let's say you use a transliterated tefillah where it tells you how to say it, that is allowed. And according to some poskim, that's even preferred. Why would that be preferred? Again, talking about what we saw earlier, how Rav Chaim Volozhin talked about the power of the words that Anshe Knesset HaGedolah composed. Because of the unique power of those words, if a person stavens in Hebrew, even if they don't understand it, there is a power to those words, and they are yotzei tefillah. If they prefer to daven in a language that they understand, they can, but it has to be a language that they understand. And then the Mishnah Berurah even adds that it needs to be a language that the community as a whole generally understands. It needs to be what's considered to be a language within the society with which they live. Okay, so a person who feels that Hebrew is too hard for them, they have two options. Either they can daven in Hebrew and then that's even if they don't understand it, or they can daven in English as long as they understand what they are saying. Yiddish, again, everyone should do the language that they understand. I want to finish. So I don't want to. Yes, agreed. Now, the last other thing, there's two other limitations which are important to this heter. If you decide to do a different language, Mishnah Berurah points out, it should be a temporary solution. And this is something that I say to anybody who asks me this question. It is okay to rely on English if that is what you are comfortable with. But you should not turn that into your permanent solution. We should all be striving to understand the Hebrew language. We should all be working towards being able to daven in Hebrew and improving it and working it. It could take a month, it could take 5 years. But there should always be in our minds, and the Mishnah is very critical of it, and he actually uses this. He quotes a number of poskim that use this, that actually are critical of some other groups of Judaism that turned the Tefilah entirely into a different language. And this is the Mishnah Berurah in source number 11. And as a result, they ended up making it what he calls into a totally different Tefilah. It no longer resembles the Tefilah as we know it. And therefore, even if a person chooses to use Hebrew, chooses to use a different language, in English, let's say for our example, it should be a temporary solution, and you should be striving constantly to daven in Hebrew so that you can be able to understand it and tap into the special kedusha of Hebrew. All right, because of time, we're going to stop. There's just in conclusion, if a person does not understand, again, we started with understanding the different reasons for why we have a set text for Tefilah. And then we moved into the major question that many of you have asked about whether or not we can daven in a different language. If a person does not, ideal is to daven in Hebrew. If a person does not, and to work on understanding it. If you don't understand the Hebrew, then you are allowed to either daven in Hebrew even without understanding it, or you can daven in any language with which you understand, realizing that that's meant to be a temporary solution, that you should be striving to eventually davening in Hebrew and understanding that Hebrew. Next week, as I mentioned, we're going to discuss the second side of the coin, which is personal tefillah and how Chazal allowed and encouraged us to not just have a set text, but to incorporate our personal tefillot into that text. I'm just going to end, but I'm happy to take any questions.